Before I leave this title slide, bang for the buck, data rate versus perception in ultra-high definition production, let me just point some stuff out on the picture on the left. Notice in this area you can see some very fine particles from the explosion, but you don't see any detail in this bright area over here. I'll get into that a little bit more later. So first let's discuss terminology. HDTV as we know it, we talk about 1080i or 1080p. We're referring to the number of lines, the vertical resolution when we do that. It's actually 1920 pixels across by 1080 down. When we talk about 4K, or 4K with little k, we're talking about perhaps 4096 pixels across rather than down. So we're suddenly changing the dimensions. We're not talking about the vertical anymore, we're talking about the horizontal. Now, 4K or 4K sounds like 4000 or 4096, but in fact, much of the so-called 4K equipment that's at the show here and that people are selling is 3840 by 2160, which is 4 times HDTV. So twice HDTV vertically, twice HDTV horizontally, which is lawsuit bait. If you buy a TV that says 4K, you take it home, you discover it's only 3840, you don't like it anymore, you sue the manufacturer. And that's why we have the term ultra-high definition being applied. The Japanese came up with the term ultra-high definition for something completely different. Consumer Electronics Association adopted it to get around that lawsuit issue. So what's being called UHD 1 or ultra-high definition 1 has quote 4K resolution, actually that 3840 across, but also possibly higher frame rates, possibly higher dynamic range, possibly a wider color gamut, possibly immersive sound, and maybe even stereoscopic 3D. By the way, I'd like to point out that the European Broadcasting Union says that the only meaning of 4K is 269 degrees Celsius below zero, because absolute zero is 0K. And we do use that terminology when we talk about 6500K or 3200K in terms of color temperature, and that's the locus of color temperatures that you see over here. Black body radiation. Now, some cautions about the methodology on this presentation. For one thing, I can't properly show anything here. What I'm going to talk about matters more for multi-camera productions, sports, concerts, things like that, than for single camera. I'm discussing only pre-compression data rates, not post-compression, and post-compression is very different. The source material matters a lot, and I'm going to show you some examples of that. And the viewing conditions matter, primarily how big the screen is, how far you are from it, but also what kind of a screen it is. On the right, you see the standard Lechner distance of 9 feet based on how rooms are shaped. You sit on the couch, the TV is at the other end of the room. But whatever the home viewing distance is, maybe it's 9 feet or 2.7 meters, maybe it's something else, there's a difference. If you're relaxed while you're watching, then maybe you lean back. If you're excited when you're watching, then maybe you lean forward. That green bar that you see in the two pictures on the left is a yardstick. So there's about a 3-foot difference in viewing distance there from the same seat, looking at the same screen. Also, whenever you go shopping for a TV, you stand much closer to it. So you're going to see things when you shop for the TV that you don't see when you have it at home. So let's talk about data rates. If you're shooting single camera and you multiply the data rate by a factor of 2, then you have 1/2 the capacity per unit. So if you were getting a certain amount of material on a terabyte drive, you now need 2 times the terabyte drive. When you're processing, if you have double the data rate, you now have 2 times the render time or 2 times the processor speed. And live shows can't use increased render time because they're live. They can't wait for that. Cable lengths. When we went from SDI, standard definition SDI, to HD SDI, suddenly we couldn't go as far because we had a much higher data rate. So as the data rate goes up, the usable cable lengths get down. That's already an issue with HD. It's much more of an issue when we go beyond HD. And finally, data rate increases are multiplicative. So if there's a certain increase for resolution, there'll be another increase for frame rate, there'll be another increase perhaps for dynamic range. All of those get multiplied into the ultimate data rate. The picture at the right is an HD SDI extender that was shown at the IBC convention in September in Amsterdam. So single camera, there are certain advantages to shooting in 4K. The data rate primarily affects capacity. It doesn't really affect anything else, assuming the camera was designed to be 4K. There's multiple benefits if you're having HDTV output. For example, you can reframe in post. You have twice the distance horizontally or vertically to reframe. We discussed that on the panel this morning. You can do image stabilization in post. So if you wanted to have what says desired HD there, and your picture was the skewed HD, you can end up with the desired HD if you shoot 4K. If you shoot HD, you end up with that little tiny rectangle, which is standard definition. There's easier filtering because you're oversampling. You can even do single sensor 3D. And there's somewhat of an increase in sharpness, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Now here's the sharpness issue. This is a chart showing, or a graph showing, contrast increasing as we go up vertically and fineness of detail or resolution increasing as we go out to the right. There are two different schools of thought about sharpness. Any word that ends in ness, N-E-S-S, means it's a psychophysical sensation. It's not a physical quantity. So sharpness is something that people say. People don't say, oh, look at the resolution on that TV. They might say, wow, look at how sharp the picture is. Sharpness is proportional either to the area under this curve or perhaps to the square of the area under this curve. I am in the camp that says it's the square of the area, which is the RCA camp. There is a Zeiss camp that says it's the area. But either way, the area under the curve is very significant. So when the first HD camcorders came out from Sony, they had HD cam. They had to compromise because they couldn't record as much data as the full 1920 would require. So they chopped it off at 1440, and that's the red dotted line that I'm showing over here, which was a very significant loss of resolution. But if you look at the curve, because the curve goes down as the detail goes up, there was a much less significant loss of sharpness. Tiny bit of the toe being chopped off rather than a tremendous amount of resolution. So Panasonic was able to chop it down even at 1280, only 2/3 of 1920. Here's a report that the European Broadcasting Union did at the Hollywood Post Alliance Tech Retreat this year in February. It's a result of their viewer tests of 4K. They were showing it on a 56-inch screen at two distances. One was 2.7 meters, or the Lechner distance, roughly 8.8 feet, standard TV viewing distance. The other was at 1.5 times the picture height. And they tested 720p, 1080i, 1080p, and UHD1, or this so-called 4K. They found really no significant difference between 720p, 1080i, and even 1080p. It looks like it's a little bit better, but it's statistically insignificant. But they did find a statistical improvement going from any one of those to 4K. So people who say you can't see 4K on a home TV at home viewing distances, they're lying. You can see it. But the maximum difference that they found was at this 1.5 times the picture height difference, and it's only half a grade of difference. So that's like the difference between very good and very good. The pictures are good in either case. So let's work out the math. Quad HD, which is this 3840 times 2160, that's 1080i HD times 4, whatever the data rate is times 4. But 4K is only progressive frames. So it's the interlaced frames times 2. So the 4K uncompressed data rate is 1080i's data rate times 8. Now you're going to find people on the floor here, notably Blackmagic Design, that are selling ultra high definition products, and they say, look, we have 6G SDI inputs. Well, 6G SDI is only 4 times the HD data rate. And so if you ask them, they'll say, oh yeah, we can do 4K, but only up to 30 frames a second. Well, that's half the number of pictures per second that we have in standard HD. Is that going to be good enough? Some people say for 4K we should be going beyond the number of pictures that we have in standard HD. So we have an 8 times increase in data rate for half a grade of improvement. If we work that out to data rate per grade of improvement, it's 16 times the data rate for a grade of improvement. Not a lot of bang for the buck. Let's look at some of the other possibilities. So here's that same European Broadcasting Union, this time at the International Broadcasting Convention in Amsterdam in September, and now they were revealing the results of their viewer tests for higher frame rate. And what they find is going either from 60 frames per second to 120 or going from 120 to 240 is a full grade of difference. So we're doubling the frame rate for a full grade. What is the bang for the buck here? We have 2 times per grade. Now, I should point out that these interim points here, they have 60 hertz at 50% and 120 hertz at 50%. That's using a 50% shutter. Now, normally when you do a 50% shutter, you see motion judder. So you see picture, picture, picture instead of seeing some nice smooth motion. But what the EBU found was that at frame rates above 100, the motion judder starts to go away. So you can get an improvement by using a shutter in addition to the improvement by using frame rate. But again, the source material matters. It's critical. Here is source material that they used. It's a toy train going around a track. If you look at the 2 pictures, the ties and the rails are identically sharp in the 2 pictures. It's only the train that's different, and you can see that the writing on the train is very different because of the higher frame rate. High dynamic range. At the same International Broadcasting Convention, there was something called the Great Debate about whether we need to go to 4K or not. And one of the speakers at the Great Debate said, one of the great things about 4K is a 4K display delivers the best HD you've ever seen. Well, if you went out on the show floor, it turns out that ARRI had a demonstration. And they were just demonstrating the quality of their Alexa camera. And they were saying, look, the Alexa is future-proof. It's good for 4K. It's good for high dynamic range. The Alexa does not have a 4K sensor. It's only 2880 across. But it does pick up more dynamic range because it has larger pixels in the sensor. So they had a Dolby reference monitor next to a 4K monitor. And this same person who made that statement, I told him to go take a look at that. And he said, yeah, you're right. The HD with higher dynamic range looks better than the 4K. High dynamic range can increase picture detail. I showed you in that first explosion there was no detail in the white part of the explosion. It's because the detail was clipped. Here's a waveform monitor indication, and on the right you can see information has been clipped over here. There's no detail. If you go to higher dynamic range, then maybe you get that detail back. Furthermore, consumer television sets already have considerably more detail than reference monitors. Our reference monitors are set for 100 nits. Consumer TV sets are now regularly coming out 800, 900 nits. So they can offer an awful lot more than the reference monitors are offering. Finer detail image sensors, if you go to a 4K sensor or beyond 4K, offer less dynamic range because the pixel is smaller. That's the blue box. Goes from a large pixel to smaller pixels. Now you can do an overall look at the entire sensor, but that takes some time. Again, a problem for sports shows or other things that are live. But also there are those black objects in there. You have to have some kind of separation between the pixels, and you need a transistor for getting the information out of the pixels. Those all eat into it. So at the moment, a 4K sensor has less dynamic range than a lower resolution sensor. And again, contrast contributes to sharpness. I can't really see that monitor from here, but those of you who are close to it probably think that the pattern on the left looks sharper than the pattern on the right. The pattern on the left has 100% contrast ratio. The pattern on the right has 98% contrast ratio. That little difference gives you a significant different look in sharpness. Also, at finer detail, contrast affects the sharpness more. So let's say I can just double the sharpness at the finest detail, which I'm showing here. Remember, sharpness is proportional to either the area or the square of the area under the curve. Well, that's affecting things farther back on the curve, not just at the finest detail. And if we went to true high dynamic range, let's say I was able to double the contrast completely, as in the green line here versus the yellow line, now I have tremendous more area under the curve. So even if I don't go to more pixels, I am delivering a much sharper picture. People at home will say, wow, that's a much sharper picture, even if it's only 1980 by 1080, standard HD resolution. Now, high dynamic range data increase, in theory, you don't really need any. Bit depth simply determines signal-to-noise ratio. So there's about 60 dB improvement in signal-to-noise ratio per bit, but that's if 1/2 of the least significant bit is noise. Not many people are very careful about doing that. Also, when we multiply signals, not many people are careful about convolving the noise back into the remaining 8 bits or 10 bits, whatever. So practically, if you don't have enough bits, you get contouring, which I'm showing here. This should be just a nice ramp from white to black, and instead you see stair steps. You see this at home sometimes when there's a nice blue sky and you suddenly see lines in the sky. The contouring gets halved with each additional bit that you add, and when you hit the point where noise occupies half of the least significant bit, then the contouring disappears completely. So let's say we decide to go with 12 bits over 10 bits. That would be a quarter of the contouring, and maybe we get that down to the noise floor. That would be increasing the data rate only by a factor of 20%. So we're not talking 2 times the data rate or 8 times the data rate, we're talking just 20% more data rate. That's something we can probably squeeze into existing facilities. The EBU is testing this, but they have not yet released the data. But based on some demonstrations that I've seen, I think this might be the biggest bang for the buck of all. If you get the high dynamic range, you might walk away saying, wow, that's an amazing picture. That's the sharpest thing I've ever seen. So let's say that it's no better than 4K. Let's say it's only half a grade improvement. Well, then that would mean this is only 40% more data rate per grade instead of 1,600% more data rate per grade for 4K or 200% more data rate for higher frame rate. Now let's talk about wider color gamut. Here is a demonstration that was done by Genoa Color Technologies. They're shooting this thing over here. They're shooting this with the camera, and this is what's being displayed on these 2 monitors. The camera is standard. The monitors, one of them is standard, and one of them is a Genoa monitor, and you see a tremendous difference here. This one is showing a red image, and this is the color that the thing is, based on the overall picture. What Genoa does is they add more primaries. Rather than having only 3 primaries, they're adding a yellow primary, and they're adding a cyan primary. So here is a display, standard Trinitron type display with 3 subpixels. Here it is with 5 subpixels. Here are various other implementations of the 5 subpixels. When you do that, you're obviously eating into the resolution. You can't do this and 4K without having some new display technology. And again, source material is critical. I don't know how many of you shoot something and somebody says, oh my God, that's the wrong color. I can't get the right color. We have to do something different. So again, source material matters. That was a very particular color that they chose for a very particular reason. Here I'm showing you some wrong colors. On the color bars over here, this is Rec 601 decoded as Rec 601. This is Rec 601 decoded as Rec 709. You can see there's definitely a difference in the color bars, but here is a properly decoded picture. Here is an improperly decoded picture in one direction. Here is an improperly decoded picture in the other direction. If you can see a difference, you're better than I. So, is it 4K versus ultra high definition? Again, 4K is 8 times the data rate. So Blackmagic Design is saying, oh, you can do that with 6G SDI. Well, no, you can't, not if you want to have 60 frames per second. So you really need 12G SDI. Now, the industry may be moving away from SDI towards Ethernet. Well, 12G is more than 10 gigabit Ethernet. So you can't even get this into 10 gigabit Ethernet. If you just want to go to 120 frames per second, if you're starting with, say, 720p, then that's only 2 times the data rate, and you can do that in 3G SDI. If you want to do 12-bit, that's only 20% more data rate. Maybe you can squeeze it in by playing with audio or something like that. And then again, things are multiplicative. So if we want to do 4K at 30 frames per second, that's 6G SDI. If we want to do 4K at 120 frames per second, that's 24G SDI. And if we want to do 4K at 120 frames per second and 12 bits, what's that, 28G SDI or something like that? So data rate matters. It is a problem. It's not something that we can deal with. If you're taking one 4K camera out and shooting with it, no problem. Build a 4K truck, lots of problems. Maybe you can't even get the signal from one end of the truck to the other because of the reduced data lengths. So, again, from the EBU high-definition roadmap at IBC in September, 4K limited viewing range. You can't be farther than 2.7 meters from the screen and still get some impact. And the maximum impact that they found, and that was at 1.5 times the height of the screen, was 1/2 of a grade of improvement. For high frame rate, high dynamic range, wide color gamut, and immersive sound, there is no limit on how far you can be from the screen or what size the screen is. And higher frame rate, they have proven, has a higher impact. My anecdotal experience, high dynamic range has a higher impact also. Again, pre-compression data rates. 4K is ×8 from either 1080i or 720p. High frame rate is ×2 or ×4, depending on whether you want to consider interlace or go up to 240. High dynamic range, wider color gamut, immersive sound, minimal change in the data rate. That's my story. Any questions? Okay, the question is, I've been talking about higher frame rate. How do I balance that with the perception that 24p is better? Absolutely, there is a perception, because we've grown up since we were kids going to movies at 24 frames per second, that 24 frames means storytelling. But if you look at The Hobbit, they decided they were going to go to a higher frame rate to be able to make things move faster and actually have more visceral impact. Certainly, if you're talking about dramatic programming, it's probably going to take us a generation to get away from the 24 frame per second. It's a different feeling, but when you do watch stuff that is intended to be live, sports, concerts, things like that, you start wishing that you had a higher frame rate. If you look at the American Cinematographer Manual, they have charts in there for panning speeds, and the panning speeds are incredibly slow. Also, if you watch a movie, there's something that I refer to as the waitress shot. There's a scene in a restaurant, and the camera starts following this waitress from the serving table over to the table where the protagonist is. The reason it's doing that is so you have something that's stationary in the image, so you don't notice all the motion judder. If you didn't have the waitress shot, if you just panned the camera, it would go strobe, 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 strobe. Okay, question is, I mentioned that 4K is only progressive, and I said that progressive is equal to interlace ×2. When we talk about 1080i today, we're talking either 29.97 frames per second, or we're talking about 59.94 fields per second. Each field is half of a frame. 59.94, roughly 60. So we're seeing 60 pictures per second. 720p is also 60 pictures per second. If we go from that to 1080p 60, we have to fill in the other half of the scanning lines that we don't have in each field. So we're going to show 1080 lines every frame or every field rather than 540 lines every field. So doing that is multiplying the data rate by 2. So that gets us to 60p, and then if we want to go from that to 4K, then it's 4 times that. The question is, what are my feelings about gamma in the future of television? There's got to be some sort of nonlinearity because our visual systems are nonlinear. Whether it's the standard gamma, whether it's something else, that remains to be seen. I mentioned that I've seen some demonstrations of high dynamic range stuff. One of the things that Dolby is proposing is that you use a high dynamic range reference monitor for doing your grading and then convert that to the signal that goes out using something called perceptual coding. So they're taking something like gamma and converting the high dynamic range into something that TVs can do. And that makes a significant improvement. Even that was a dramatic improvement in stuff that I saw. The question is, when I have high frame rate, does that affect depth of field and the amount of light that you have? Yes, if you're shooting at a higher frame rate, then you're having less time for the exposure. It's as if you're going to a 50% shutter or something like that. So you do either require more light or a larger aperture. If you go for a larger aperture, then you're reducing the depth of field. So yes, that is an issue. But one nice thing is it doesn't affect the lenses. So you can use the existing lenses at a higher frame rate. I'm not sure if I'm getting the question, but I think it's that the CIE diagram shows us more colors than we can get in high definition. Can we get those colors, but we're not seeing them on the monitor here? Yeah, well, let's go back here. I think that everybody, even on this monitor, can see the difference between that red and that purple. But that red and that purple were chosen very specifically for this demonstration, and the fact that you can see the difference between that red and that purple on this monitor, which has only 3 primaries, means that it was rigged. So it's a demonstration that was done specifically to show that that particular technology will give you something more. But you're seeing it on a 3 primary monitor, and you're seeing the difference between those 2 pictures. So here's the CIE diagram over there. The outer edge of that sort of tongue-shaped thing that's going around, those are all the colors that we can see. Everything within that tongue shape is colors that can be seen. But there's a much smaller shape that goes inside that, and I don't have it on this diagram, but it's potentially smaller than even the pentagram that's in there, and it's called Poynter's real surface colors. And those are the only colors that exist in things that we have in the real world. So we can see more colors that exist in things that we're going to shoot. And there are 1 or 2 times when that will be an issue. The Salem cigarette package was a sort of really saturated turquoise, just impossible to shoot on television. But it's very rare that you're going to run into that. And on that, I'm afraid I've run out of time, so thank you all for coming.